Call legal committee to order. It is Wednesday, December 18th, and the time is 2:22. First item on the agenda is roll call to determine quorum. Karen, if you could please call the roll.
Ms. Fastianos?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Keycapper?
Here.
Bloomer, Scott, Ms. Aldine?
Yes. Here.
Ms. Williamson?
Here.
Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. Same as this morning, to observe this meeting, go to trpa.gov under the calendar header and click on governing board hybrid meeting. To address the community members with your comments. If you're in person, I'll call you up to this chair when it's public comment time. If you're joining us remotely, either click the raise hand button at the bottom of the Zoom screen or dial *9. In any format of public comment, we'll have 3 minutes of public comment to address the committee per speaker. Next item is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Yeah,
No changes.
thank you. So we'll deem the agenda approved for the record as filed. Agenda item 2, approval of the minutes. We have a draft set of minutes from November 20th, 2024 on page 53 of your packet. Does anyone have any changes to the minutes?
No, I move to approve them as presented.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone object? Motion passes. Let's move on then to agenda item 3, which is the discussion and possible direction to staff regarding Tahoe Blue Event Center, TRPA file number ERSP 2017-1212, permit compliance and traffic reduction adaptive management plan update. Information on this item can be found on page 277 of your packets. A reminder to the public, after board discussion on this item, you may raise your hand in person or just come up to this chair, or we can call on you on Zoom or on the phone. John Marshall, if you could please present this item.
Thank you. Okay, so we're gonna run through a slideshow and then I think Lou Feldman will speak on behalf of TDBA, and then I believe Julie will finish her lunch by then, Edie, and come up and provide some, maybe a little bit of context, then we'll go into discussion and public comment. Next slide, please. So I think everyone's relatively familiar with the event center. It opened in it was approved in 2020 as a new South Shore public venue for events. So we'll be talking a lot about the fact that the event center itself adds trips and adds VMT. Just looking at it as a standing facility. It's built as a 5,000 seat facility, but it was analyzed and approved as a up to 6,000 seat facility. It was a controversial project. It's a redevelopment project. It was controversial because of the trip and VMT aspects in the main about the project. And there was an extensive environmental assessment done for the project, which was the subject of significant public comment, particularly by the League and the California Attorney General's office. And we'll walk through and talk about some of those issues. Next slide, please. So let's zero in on net zero VMT, because that's going to be a critical concept. When the project was kind of designed and approved as a net zero project. So the event center itself generates trips and it generates VMT. People are coming from, various distances and are attending events at the event center. So that generates VMT. The project was going to be net neutral because of elements added that would reduce VMT, primarily through casino, the implementation and enforcement of casino paid parking, but also to a lesser degree, a new microtransit in the South Shore. So the whole kind of concept behind the project for VMT purposes was that we needed to offset the trips generated by the trips avoided. in these, in this kind of, so you basically, they at a minimum balance out. So let's go to the next slide. No, excuse me. I'm sorry. I want to touch on a couple of things. How do you measure VMT? Measure VMT through two related concepts. One is the number of trips that are generated by something and the distance of those individual trips. So you multiply the number of, I mean, I'm speaking very broadly here. You multiply the number of trips by the distance of the average distance of the trips to get you vehicle miles traveled for that particular trip, or if they're annualized for that particular year. Okay. The controversy with this project was in part over the assumptions that were used in the traffic analysis of how many trips would be generated and the length of those trips. So both components of the VMT equation, there was significant controversy. And so the parties got together in a stakeholder setting, and I think you heard the league representative talk about that a little bit. And together with the league and the CalAG and TRPA and TDBA, we hammered out a extensive set of permit conditions and adaptive management and monitoring that reflected the uncertainty and a bit of the disagreement over the traffic analysis that was part of the environmental assessment. Next slide, please. The key element in regarding VMT were the performance measures that were set up in the permit itself and in the adaptive management program. And we're really going to talk today just about that first one. And the first permit, there'd be no net increase in trips and vehicle miles traveled. We're basically going to treat those as equivalent. There's obviously a difference, but for this discussion, it really doesn't make sense to separate those two things. But essentially, so I'm going to talk mainly about VMT and how trips function within that. But this performance measure also talks about trips. It also, what it says is no additional VMT, no net increase in VMT annually, or for individual events on peak summer days. So if you think about that, for an annual calculation, it means that the reduction in parking, paid parking, and the trips saved as a result of paid parking and the trips saved as a result of microtransit were greater, at least equal or greater than the number of trips, new trips added as a result of the events at the event center. So that's the annual, and that during the summer, peak summer days, there would be no individual concert that would generate more trips than those saved at that date by the parking, paid parking, and the microtransit provided that day. So there's two things that had to balance. VMT and trips, VMT and the trip reduction of paid parking and microtransit annually and peak summer days. Next slide, please. Special condition 7 of the permit also restricted the number of events and events days, which relevant to our discussion today. The number of events was capped at 130. Those events could have multiple days associated with them, but they could not exceed 220 event days total. We're going to be mainly talking about the number of events as opposed to the event days later in our discussion. The small print talks about a couple things that I wanted to highlight. the permit assumes that there will be no increase in in events and event days for not less than 3 years. In order to allow additional trips, this condition will have to be amended. And only the governing board can do that. If it's before 3 years. If it's after 3 years, this condition specifically allows the executive director to make that change if the reductions in VMT are great enough to offset any increase in the number of event days.
So, sorry to interrupt, John, but it would have to be a positive recommendation from the stakeholder group, right?
Correct. I'm speaking broadly, but just
Okay.
basically, if that happens, then the executive director has the discretion after 3 years, but not before that. The governing board has discretion to change any of these permit conditions at any time it chooses to do so. Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, a key part of the permit was the adaptive management plan and the monitoring, which we'll talk about. So condition C of the adaptive management plan require that TDVA monitor pre and post commencement or pre and post commencement, commencement of event center operations according to Appendix B, which was how you go about doing the actual monitoring. And then it also included metrics, adaptive management metrics, for potential increases above what was offset by paid parking and microtransit in the major exceedance and minor and major exceedances conditions of the permit, which essentially laid out the numerical values, and then it also has a process by which, if there's an exceedance, parties shall meet and confer essentially and figure out a way to offset any increase or exceedance of VMT that occurred either annually or at a single event. Now, the question begs itself then, how do you measure VMT? Next slide, please. Excuse me, yeah, VMT. And essentially, if you remember, we talked about trips and length of trip. The difference really in the parties and some of the assumptions focused on the number of trips that either paid parking or would be generated by would be saved by paid parking or generated by the event center. A lot of the trip generation is based on modeling and various assumptions. And there was disagreement over the validity of the traffic analysis that was done. So to create a common way forward, the group designed and then the governing board approved a mechanism to monitor those elements. Bluetooth is just a reference to a technology. Basically, I'm gonna butcher it, but RF frequencies, they can be picked up by, or the Bluetooth connection can be monitored by sensors placed next to the road, and as cars go by, it basically counts the number of cars that either enter or exit through not a gate per se, but just what electronically through monitoring the occupants of the car. Did I get that close enough, Paul? And the Bluetooth, so that we colloquial call it Bluetooth because that's what's identified in the monitoring attachment, which is attachment B to the permit. Bluetooth was to be implemented prior to the opening of the event center so that there would be a baseline Bluetooth was the agreed upon way to measure the number of trips. It was basically agreed that big data sources, which I have a tenuous hold on and we can talk about if you want, and surveys would be the mechanism to get the length of trip of each trip, or an average length. So Bluetooth really focuses in on the number of trips in the VMT equation as opposed to the length of trip. It was supposed to, you'll see in the blue triangles, are basically surrounding the casino core to be able to accurately measure the number on a 24/7, 365 basis, the number of vehicles that were coming in and out of the entryways to the core. Next slide, please. Before we go into kind of now moving into what happened, any questions so far if you want to discuss? Okay. Event Center opened in 2023. For that first year, there were 23-24, there were 94 events, 143 event days, and about 82,000 attendees. The Event Center, as you heard, is turned into a significant gathering place for South Shore, not only for concert, big level events, but also for smaller type events, weddings, group events, etc. Next slide, please. The next couple slides look at the mitigation that was required, or the conditions that were required, and whether or not they were implemented. So first, let's look at if you remember that chart between events generating traffic, and this is a slide regarding the paid parking and micro transit to decrease the number of trips to offset. Paid parking was required by the date of opening, and it was actually in place as of January of 2023. So it's in place, and it was in place decreasing the number of trips prior to the point where there is any trip increase. Microtransit had a number of conditions related to it, and it was, again, it was required to be initiated before, excuse me, at the same time as initiation of operations of the event center, and was actually initiated about a year prior. The requirements at the date of opening under the permit were to extend the microtransit to just the core, the casino core, and some areas surrounding it. The actual service area was larger than that. So again, you can anticipate that additional trips were offset as a result of the extended start date and service area. And also these next two things, the number of days the microtransit was required by the permit only for summer and holidays. And that was deemed sufficient to offset the number of trips generated. And there was service hours, and the actual service hours were a little broader by an hour in the evening. And the service was provided year round as opposed to just 148 days. The one area that the provided microtransit did not come up to spec was in the wait time. 15 minutes was what was in the permit. And basically for that first year, we saw wait times usually longer than 15 and up to 30. And then finally, there was a booking by app, phone app, I think, and that was it as well. Next slide, please. As to the monitoring plan, all the elements of the monitoring plan were implemented except for the Bluetooth counters. The mobile device data, which is the big data that I talked about, that was purchased. All the surveys were initiated, and I think Paul, if you want to, can answer questions about surveys, and Lou and Cheryl are here as well, if there's any questions about any of the survey work that was required to be done. So let's focus on the big red square, or is that a rectangle?
Yes.
The Bluetooth data was not installed and has not been installed. We have been in discussions with TDVA over the last year. And about what to do about that. The biggest consequences associated with the lack of Bluetooth traffic data is that we lost what we thought was the best way to figure out the baseline for the number of trips associated with the operation of the core prior to operation of both paid parking for a couple of the casinos and operation of the event center. TDVA did do a couple days of I think there were hose monitoring. That I think what it was, not Bluetooth, but a couple days in the summer prior to opening of traffic counts. And then, so there was essentially, I think TDVA is probably best qualified to explain to you why they chose not to implement the Bluetooth requirement. Yes.
And that's fine. They can, whether it was because of financial, issues, or it was just not feasible, but I mean, our permit, when you have a condition in a permit and that condition is not met, generally, at the very least, let's say that it was never feasible. It was never a feasible alternative. Isn't it incumbent upon the permittee to advise the agency that they are not going to be able to comply with the conditions of the permit prior to simply not complying?
Yes.
Okay.
So the
And that was
way
never
that,
done.
correct. The way that you address a situation in which either you feel the permit is, for some reason, should be changed, is to apply to revise the or amend the permit.
And that was never done.
Correct. There are, as you will hear, there are data available that can provide information regarding the number of trips. In other words, to substitute for the Bluetooth data that can be utilized, not to measure necessarily the baseline, but to measure the impact of an event and then cumulatively the annual operations of the event. And that's the gate counters, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. So now we're kind of coming to the meat of the program, and that's staff's request for direction from you, the legal committee, on how to approach the going forward operations of the event center. And we're going to talk about these in turn. First one is, what do we do in the absence of Bluetooth? How do we move forward? And we'll have a proposal. Possible VMT exceedance last summer and how to treat that exceedance. And then how to count local events, or this is the request of the Nevada Oversight Committee to look at what's colloquial called local events, which we'll talk about. Next slide, please. TDBA has asked the agency to essentially consider amending the permit. Of course, post determination not to implement Bluetooth. That is a mechanism to really focus on, instead of having a Bluetooth counter at entrances, rely on the gate counting at the casinos to provide that same level of the number of trips that generated by an event. This will also provide the numbers of actual parkers or vehicles parked that could then, goes into an equation that figures out how many trips were saved as a result of the parking having to be paid for. As you heard Lou talk about at the public comment period, there is some element of backcasting here that the parking gate data was started on in January of 23. So there's some ability to look about 8 months worth of data prior to the opening of the event center, but not prior to the full implementation of paid parking. Is that right? The paid parking by that point had already been.
We got a four behind a year.
Staff is at this point, given where we are, and you'll hear more from Julie, we are recommending moving forward with the gate counts as the best mechanism to measure the impact of the event center and its operations. Next slide, please. Let's talk for a minute about the information that we do have and what does it indicate. So with traffic count data from, I believe this is based on a number of sources, but including the gate data. We can do some relatively decent calculations based generating the number of trips and the length of each trip, and to look at both what happened on the average annually for 23 to 24 year, and about peak summer days. Now, annually, you remember, I mean, if you remember that, so as an annual figure, paid parking operates every day. There's events only on a certain number of days. So you're aggregating trip savings every day through operation of paid parking that would have been there, but for the fact that you have to pay for it. And there's a coefficient that you use, and you can calculate on a relative, you can decide whether you want a conservative or more liberal coefficient. And we took a relatively, this is described in the staff report, take a relatively conservative trip generation and parking savings. And it indicates that for the annual average, or so overall through the operation of the event center, there has been no net VMT. In other words, the paid parking has offset sufficiently the number of trips generated by the, what it was, 94 events that occurred in 2023, 2024. However, so that's good news. We wish it had been as a result of the operation of Bluetooth, but there you have it. However, when we looked at each individual event for that year, there was one event that had sufficient attendance, and it was about 2,400 people, that at the time on that day, there was not sufficient cars parked in order to apply the coefficient to get you the savings necessary to make that event no net in our calculations. So that we think that was a possible exceedance. We, unfortunately, Dan Segan is off vacationing in Australia, lucky him. And so we'll try to cover for you if you want to get into the level of adequacy of that finding, of both these findings, but I can describe it at a very high level. That one event was the Colin Jost concert undertaken during the I'm gonna butcher this, American Century Golf Tournament. And TDVA, as you'll hear, believes that because of the unique circumstances of those two events happening, that their traffic calculations put them in compliance. The direction that we seek here is that we treat this possibility of an exceedance as a minor exceedance. And that we then trigger the adaptive management requirements associated with that in the permit and start coordinating with the stakeholders on additional mechanisms to offset VMT. We're not prejudicing it right now with saying what the specific item should be, but just I think staff wants to just to commence those discussions on what might be available and adequate to offset that individual event. We're now going to move on. Hold on, before we click, we're going to move on to local events. Are there any questions before we head to local events and leave the kind of Bluetooth / VMT exceedance issues?
Yeah, John, in the staff report, it talked about the estimates for the single event, July 13th. So that's on page 279 of the deck.
Yeah.
So those numbers remain TRPA's assessment of the trips that day.
Our best estimate. That's not really sitting down with TDVA and going over a recent letter as to the number of how they feel the counts should have been done.
And then so the 1,164 trips is basically a 50% cut rate from the attendance of the event. Is that how that calculation is done?
Say that again, please.
The estimated 1,164 trips, that's half of the number of attendees. Is that
Basically 2 people per
Yeah.
car.
was the event itself affiliated with the golf tournament?
That you can ask.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being at the tournament and they were like, they played around with Jimmy Fallon or something the next day. I don't remember, but so is there any assessment of whether or not those attendees actually made those trips, or is it just a rough map?
This is rough.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Local events.
So before you move on, so I understand the minor exceedance, and I understand that this is kind of an opportunity to, reconvene the stakeholders group and to implement additional mitigations to compensate for that. I kind of understand, although I'd like more information about why Bluetooth wasn't implemented as originally agreed to. But obviously there were some other missteps along the way with respect to surveying. It was never done, apparently, at least in the compliance with the requirements of the permit.
We can talk about that, the surveying elements, but
Okay.
as you kind of saw at that one chart about
Mhm.
the information generating the surveys, that was all implemented. So I think it's staff's position that the survey work has been done according to the permit.
Okay, so I guess this is a question for Julie. Who was the point person at the agency to enforce the elements of the permit? And is that been done? Obviously, it wasn't done as rigorously as it might have been.
Yeah,
Um,
I definitely want to speak to that, but let me just give you the short answer, and then I can elaborate on
Okay.
that when we finish the presentation. It varies by project, you know, this is a very large project, so Paul Nielsen worked on that, but we also have our compliance team and Steve Sweet. The level of tracking and mitigation does vary, you know, master plans, Heavenly, for example, has a very prescribed way that we track and monitor. I would say, maybe I'll ask Paul to come up and just give you a quick snapshot of what was involved, but lesson learned, like, we share some responsibility of not catching this sooner. And that's part of what we want to talk to you about. But maybe I'll ask Paul to just speak to what was done, because one thing I wanted to make clear on the record is that this was a very complicated and unique project, and there was a lot of enforcement and compliance along the way during the construction, groundwater, you know, interception, construction management. We were very involved in many aspects of enforcement and compliance. In terms of the monitoring, maybe I'll turn it over to Paul, who knows a lot more about this.
Yeah, well, it was in April of 22 that they indicated the Bluetooth probably wasn't the best approach. And so that's when we started thinking about how do we deviate? Well, we can't deviate from the permit, so we got to go to the stakeholders. And we held 3 stakeholder meetings with them to talk about alternatives. And there was no agreement to deviate at that time. And meanwhile, the event center opened and the Bluetooth monitors didn't go in. And so, you know, defer to Lou on through that decision.
So if we can, what I think the question is the right question. I also want to put in the record too, just when you think of when this was approved in 2020, you know, it was right at the beginning of COVID. And there were a lot of things that were upside down. I mean, 1 million Americans have died since that permit was executed. So I would say we were struggling to hang on as an agency through that period of time, as was the whole world. But no excuses, and that's why we're bringing this forward today, to remedy that and use this as a good example of when we have a very unique project like this, of which we really haven't seen a project like this scale in the basin. You know, what is that protocol for those 60 conditions? Because there were a lot of moving parts in the
I
permit.
think there was optimism that there was a better way to collect the data, you know, since the event center was approved and we had the large stakeholder together. You know, big data kind of came to the table, and that maybe that was a better way to leverage the traffic monitoring information in the core. Streetlight was being used by different entities, and so that was, you know, that was discussed. Is that a better way? Is it cheaper? Is it more accurate? Is it a better way to correct VMT? But unfortunately, you know, there was never agreement as to whether or not that was a suitable replacement for the Bluetooth. And so as the event center, you know, construction was concluding and booking events. And we did engage the stakeholders on 3 different times to talk about this sort of evolution of the need to collect this data and what the best approach was. In the meantime, the event center opened. And so that monitoring never occurred while these conversations were going on. Then there was
The Bluetooth.
the Bluetooth monitors, yes.
Right, no, I understand that.
There was other monitoring, there were surveys happening, you know, post-opening of the event center that I can speak to. But that's really what happened was the discussion evolving to making sure that we weren't leveraging the best source of information.
So we are kind of a victim of our desire to be inclusive by having these conversations with other organizations and other stakeholders, right? Because I mean, we could have made the decision to enforce the permit and require the installation of the Bluetooth. But because we wanted to engage the community, we wanted to be, as I say, as inclusive as possible, we went to the stakeholders, but we got no consensus. So
Yeah,
at that time, we probably should have made a command decision of some sort.
yeah, we felt it was important to honor the process that we used to go into the event center recommendations to the board. And particularly the league and the AG, in that us making sort of a unilateral decision about substituting streetlight, for example, with Bluetooth, we just didn't feel was appropriate. We felt that Bluetooth needed to be implemented unless a decision by the board, as endorsed by the stakeholders, was brought to the table. And we didn't feel like we had the authority to deviate from the permit.
Oh, no, I'm not suggesting that. I mean, you'd have to involve the stakeholders to come up with some alternatives, but we did have the ability to implement the permit condition that
Yes,
Bluetooth be used.
yes.
And during that time period, we specifically requested TDVA to implement Bluetooth.
But it was never done.
Correct.
So if I do have a question on that. It seems to me I've sort of three questions. One is, I think a problem that I'm struggling with is going forward, we have to talk about what we're doing going forward, but we don't have a baseline to measure off of, right? That's the issue, is that so we don't know what net is.
Yeah.
But you had mentioned there was maybe data looking backwards. Is this something we can is there any way to extrapolate out a baseline that people like can maybe agree on?
Can I jump in on that one? Because it speaks to the heart of your question, Shelley. I mean, the complexity of this project has been, it's been difficult to even get agreement on basic facts around what happened with the permit. And we had a lot of experts look at this. We could not come up with a reliable way to re-engineer the baseline. That took 8 months of discussions with lots of different experts involved. What we think we have on the table now is a new path forward with this gate data. So I think we've had a breakthrough, and that's part of what the discussion is, that we, at least going back to January of 23 before it opened. That's the ability for us to then look at that and have you consider that.
And really the loss of the baseline data. Where the rubber meets the road on that is the kind of complex coefficient that goes into measuring how many cars did not drive up as a result of the paid parking.
Hmm.
You can measure the number of trips generated by an event. And you can measure the number of cars parked on that day. But what the baseline is going to help us do is to get a more solid figure on the number of trips that would be associated with the paid portion of that paid parking. The reduction in the number of trips associated with that. So what we're left to rely on is not Tahoe specific. It's more kind of what has been found in other places, the efficacy of paid parking as a trip reducer. So that's what was part of the controversy over the initial traffic report that relied on those kind of, textbook coefficient and experiential based coefficients rather than any Tahoe specific data.
Yeah, it was, in the initial environmental analysis for the event center, we found there really wasn't a lot of information out there in the literature about the efficacy of paid parking.
Okay. Go ahead, Ben. Well, I was gonna say, so legally then I'm struggling with, we sort of have two questions, right? It's like, how do we modify the permit going forward, and how do we deal with this non-compliance between here and there? And it's legal, these are both going to the board, correct?
Yep.
Any recommendation out of this committee has to go through the full board.
Let's talk about that for a minute,
Okay,
because any permit modification has to go to the board. Any resolution of enforcement, as you know, comes through legal with a recommendation to the governing board for approval or not, or adjustment or whatever. So if it falls within one of those two areas, then yes, the board, what will happen will be staff will take your direction and then implement either by coming up with permit amendments or maybe a violation resolution, and move forward on that ground. That will then come back either for you for a recommendation on the enforcement stuff or straight to the board on the permit amendments, if there's any permit amendments that need to be done.
I'd like to, at some point, talk to my legal committee, given sort of the interest in this issue and the comments we've had. I would like this to go back to the board regardless, but I'll leave that to us to discuss as well. I think this is probably a full board issue, even if traditionally it would only run through legal.
any approval or change, any action, definitive action is taken by the governing board.
Okay,
We just
I just-
normally handle most
here,
routine violations on the
Right.
consent calendar, basically
Yeah.
consent agenda.
So
right?
which,
As
either
opposed to
way, I just,
hearing.
thank you, I just wanna make it
Yeah.
crystal clear, we're not doing anything here that the full board will hear about, see.
One way or the other.
One way or the other, thank you, just wanna make that clear. Ben, do you have? Not right now, okay, sorry, go ahead then, please.
okay, so are we ready to move on to our last issue of local events? That doesn't mean we're not gonna have additional times for discussion, but we have the benefit of more presentation and,
Mhm.
okay. So the last issue is what to do with local events. The Legislative Oversight Committee, the Nevada Legislature heard this issue and raised by a number of members of the public and I believe TDBA as to what, how do you treat local events? And what we define a local event as is something that would happen that otherwise that would be local. So like a graduation or a, really a South Shore function that would occur someplace else, but could occur at the event center. And is there any reason to treat that as an event if it would have occurred anyway
In the South Shore area.
in the South Shore area? So in other words, what that means is there a classification of events that already are VMT neutral? All you're doing is shifting the locus or the site of where the event is happening. And so that's an event. We've determined that's an event that needs to be counted by the 130 cap. Unless the board decides different. Or unless after 3 years of implementation, i.e. in 2026, the executive director can look at the data and if there's sufficient VMT savings can make that change, or it determined that they're not increased, is not an increase in VMT in the first place, because it's a local. So that's the issue. And the oversight committee heard testimony on this, and in their recommendations requested that TRPA consider exempting some of these local events. Some are all local events.
My inclination would be to defer that until we get a resolution to these more outstanding issues. That's just my opinion. And I appreciate, the fact that the oversight committee has weighed in, but for example, you may have a graduation that is limited by the capacity of the other venue. But the capacity of the event center is considerably larger, so you may have more people participating. You may have people coming in from outside of the basin to participate in that event. I just think it muddies the water at a time when we need to focus on the crux of the issue, which has to do with permit compliance.
The way that we've had discussions in the, there's been a lot of discussion. This is not just come up since the oversight committee.
Right.
It's been an issue that has been raised, and there's been discussion with parties about it, and it really is focusing on how do you define events that are no net. And so they would take into account things like that, or if it's a significantly longer distance to the event center than otherwise, or how do you define the event that would not count as legitimately, not count as an event because it's neutral at a minimum. Which your point is well taken. So that's it, unless there's more questions about local events. Otherwise, we'll turn it over to Lou to make a presentation and then Julie to wrap up.
Windows development.
You speak up, Lou?
The owl has to pick up your
Yes.
testimony. Can we move this further down? Are we out of court? Or Lou, why don't you come sit here?
I'd love to sit
Okay.
next to you.
Well, I doubt that, but that's okay.
Too bright sitting next to John with that jacket.
And I do want to digress before I start to thank John Marshall for the decades that I have worked with him and his exemplary performance on behalf of the agency. It's been a true honor for me to have that relationship.
It's like his poor choice of clothing.
No, he's
I
just,
thought
he's
that-
angling for the jacket. Obviously, he's angling for the jacket.
And, with that said, just, some preliminary facts. TDVA is a public entity. TDVA issued $112 million in municipal bonds to build this facility. The facility is, everybody, I think, is generally, we don't always agree on much, but most people agree, turned out pretty good. It's not as large as we thought it would be in terms of capacity. And this is heavily a condition permit as, TRPA issues. If we wrote this permit today, it would read entirely different than it read in 2020. And a couple of, fundamental, paradigm issues are important, I think, for everybody to understand. When the permit was written, March of 2020, the conversation concerning baseline said the baseline should be determined in 2020 or 2021 if they are eligible. We had COVID going on. If not, the baseline's 2019. So the default baseline is 2019, not the year before operations. Nobody likes 2019. We've tried to have these conversations. We can supplement it with big data. We can kill a lot of brain cells talking about baseline, and we have, by the way. The casualty is significant. And from the moment these conversations started, TDBA never said, we won't install Bluetooth monitors. But when you look at the permit doesn't say that they have to be installed by a date, number one. Number two, the permit references that the cost for this will be $16,000 a year or about $70,000 over 5 years. And in reality, we didn't know this at the time, the cost is about $200,000 a year or $1 million. So is that a good use of public dollars? And as you may be aware, TTD is applied for a grant that should be acted on this month for $9.5 million to do this kind of monitoring. That gives you an order of magnitude. Which, we pointed out some time ago, maybe that's a better way we could collaborate with them, but we've never said no. What we have said is the permit requires traffic counts to be conducted using an electronic sensor system. It also says the purpose of this monitoring is to provide comprehensive counts of the traffic activity in the 4 casinos. Well, again, we didn't know in 2020 that we were going to have electronic sensors at every entrance into every parking area at every casino. So we can buy that data. It's $2,000 a month to buy that data. We've said we're happy, not happy. I mean, we will spend $2,000 a month to buy that data. And that will not only provide data that is contemporary, but it will provide backdated data, though I can tell you the permit nor Appendix B requires this to have been installed 1 year prior to the opening of the event center. So we have been at the table. TRPA has been at the table. Julie's taken me to the woodshed. And we have always said, look, we want to find a path forward. We're a willing victim in this. We're not saying no. But again, if we wrote this permit today, we wouldn't even be talking about events because events are meaningless. They don't tell you anything. Many of our events are 15 people. An event cap, is, we didn't know what we didn't know, so we have an event cap. But that's the wrong metric. It's the wrong paradigm. It makes no sense. And at 2,000 attendees during the first year. The analysis demonstrates, in Exhibit 6 Exhibit 5 to my submittal, the traffic engineer who is available and is on the call if we want to talk to Leslie Swin. We could have 1 million people on an average annual basis and not violate the trip standard. 1 million people. We can't do 1 million people. We can't do 500,000 people. If we hit it out of the park over 5 years, we might get to 250. And we're still not going to have a VMT issue. So, you know, this conversation is certainly appropriate, but we're talking about a lot of stuff that really doesn't matter. And I think the parties, all parties would be better served if we actually understood what it is we're trying to measure and then make sure that we comply with the requirements. John brought up a really important point. Maybe it was Paul. They work well together. The EA concluded that there would be a reduction in trip generation by 10.7% due to paid parking. How do you measure that? We can't monitor that because you can't measure people who won't come. So the best data we have is 10.7%. If you take that 10.7% and apply it to either average annual or peak summer, we are reducing VMT way beyond what we could ever possibly generate. There's no threat. In an average annual basis, there is zero risk. Zero. So, you know, we've spent well over $100,000. We can spend multiples of that, and we're not going to have any more clarity. We have a path forward, I think. I think the path forward is let's contemporize this permit because now we have actual real world experience. We can use that experience. We understand that, you know, an event cap, it is the complete wrong metric. An attendance cap makes sense. We don't have to talk about community events. We have to talk about what does it take to trip the wire? And I can tell you that as we sit here today, I am impressed with the creativity to characterize 69 possible trips on July 13th when 20,000 people were at the celebrity golf tournament across the street. Characterize 69 trips as a possible minor exceedance. You know, and if that's the battlefield, okay, well, we initiated a van pool program that reduced 73 trips that day, so there was still a net negative. We can go on and on and on this. And we are team players. We have never not returned a phone call. We have never not attended a meeting. We have never not said, let's solve this problem. And we are here to solve the problem. I, with all due respect, you know, appreciate the league's input. We've also sat down with Gavin. We worked constructively, we think, to find a path forward. The thirst for a violation here is a mystery to me. With a couple of other things that, you know, are just gravy, I suppose. But, you know, John mentioned that, you know, we had an obligation to provide microtransit. The obligation was to provide it for 3 years, summer only, years 4 and 5, summer and winter, and then year 6, year round, within a defined service area. 1 year before the event center opened, we provided year-round microtransit, 7 years ahead of schedule. And the service area is 2 or 3 times what was required. And this year, microtransit will move about 250,000 people. We had no requirement to initiate a van pool program, but we started a van pool program. The initial analysis when we started this was we had 10 van pools, which was documented. That would reduce VMT by 200,000 a year. We're now at 13 van pools and rising. What a great VMT, we can measure that, by the way. We can actually measure that in-basin VMT reduction. You know, we didn't know when we initiated this this event cap conversation that we would have a professional hockey team. Well, the professional hockey team has 36 home games. You know, that's like 30% of our capacity. And, you know, thank you for the support we've experienced in the community. The enthusiasm is contagious. The team is on a winning streak. They're likely to be in the playoffs. That means up to 46 games. Well, we had no clue that we were going to have a professional sports team. And again, you know, the event cap now is telling us that when TRPA wants to host a couple of events in February of 15 people, we have to say no. That's crazy. So again, we didn't know what we didn't know. And with real information and experience, you know, we can do a lot of good stuff. By the way, we didn't have to, but we've now partnered with the TTD to provide fixed route service for hockey games and larger events. You know, we hope that's hugely successful. So you don't need to take us to the woodshed. We really are here to do the right thing and welcome the opportunity for the legal committee to provide guidance and input. We want to get this behind us. We've spent a lot of money. We'll continue to do what is right and look forward to your input and guidance.
Questions, Shelley or Ben?
Do you want to hear Julie's kind of wrap up and then open for general questions?
Yeah, I did. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. This is perhaps more philosophical, right? But like, I presume someone Fertitta doesn't buy a hotel on the shore of Lake Tahoe to hopefully maintain the status quo in terms of its visitor volume, right? Do we have anything that requires a property owner to offset VMT if they generate new business into their property?
What we do is in that situation, we analyze essentially what is use the ITE, the International Transportation Engineers book industry standard, close enough, that sets a rate.
Okay.
And so we don't really look at what the existing trip base based on vacancy rates. We look at it based on ITE. And then the new rate will be based on ITE. So those basically, unless they're adding rooms, those wash. So there is not in most of our VMT calculation an anticipation that the new occupant will be doing greater business than the old occupant if it's the same business. If it's a different kind of business, then it depends on those rates.
And it's triggered with a permit for some new project.
So it's just a
The answer
change
to
of
your
ownership.
question.
There's no,
I guess what I'm getting at, what are we I mean, we have, with an event center got built, right? That was gonna be having events, right? Assumingly so. It was gonna attract people, assumingly so, recognized by the permit. But I'm not sure I say this right, so I might stop because I don't know if I'm going to. It seems like the entire program is created around an idea that the growth and success will be bad if we can somehow, I'll do 100% net zero offset. And I understand that's the condition, that's the philosophy, so be it, it's not mine. But like the suggestion that we as a board take a punitive action against something that we don't even know was real or exists, right? A possible violation, and we're going to take a punitive action against another sort of local government entity, right, or quasi-governmental entity, just seems like a really strong statement that we aren't happy with their success.
well, I guess I would respond to that by this is different than your, let's try to do better than the prior owner, because there was no prior owned.
No, I get that, and it's probably not a fair comparison, right?
Well,
I'm trying to understand like traffic policies to either disincentivize growth, right?
Right, what the policy is not to disincentivize growth, is to disincentivize this basic use of the private automobile as the primary mechanism by which to move people in the basin.
Sure, I get that. I just,
But I think your point is that everything is in flux. I mean, years ago, we didn't know that Indian gaming would have the sort of impact it's had on the state line casinos. And I suspect it has significantly impacted, the number of rooms that are rented on an annual basis, the number of people who come to visit for other reasons, to game, to gamble. So, it's hard to take those variations it's hard to quantify those variations, because in some cases, they're going to reduce VMT, and in other cases, they may increase VMT. But because, as pursuant to your suggestion, this is not a new permit, it's a change in ownership, they might do a better job of marketing their property, and therefore more people come to visit. So it is not a precise science, you're right, and that's part of the problem.
When I think what Ben's struggling with is like, this is good for the community. We want people at events, and it feels punitive that they're coming to events. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, yes, to some extent, and then to, especially if we could make an argument that they didn't even violate it, right?
Well, I don't think the TRPA's required motions, your suggested motions are punitive. I mean, there's no monetary penalty for violating the permit, right?
But it sends them back to put in additional monitoring, right?
Well, but I
Or
think that there's-
additional compliance.
Well, I understand this was a very unique project, and some of we were kind of going along blindly. I mean, making assumptions that maybe weren't accurate. And that's why I think that this particular permit should be a little bit fungible, because there were a lot of unknowns at the time, and that's why we have the adaptive management process, so that we can make those tweaks and those adjustments. But I think by the same token, there were some oversights, and Julie's already, to her credit, admitted that, maybe the level of our involvement should have been greater, as the overseer. So I mean, and that's perfectly fine. I think honesty is incredibly important, that we admit when we're wrong, and that we find a path forward, as Lewis suggested.
And I think
And-
that's so well said, because it's sort of the other side of that is our permits have to mean something, right? They have to mean something, and these are permits we agree to, but to your point, we saw the world, but the world always changes. So that's sort of, I think, I want to hear from Julie, but it does seem like the balance we're trying to strike is recognizing that, right? But moving forward together. And I guess I know the league is here. I do wonder about the animosity there, though, because you have been able to work well in the past. So I'm wondering, this might not be a fair question. What do you think, if you had to argue for them, you're a lawyer, right? If you had to argue for them, what's their best argument that you're hearing? Where's the disagreement?
Well, I have characterized it perhaps pejoratively, and sometimes I get carried away, as, a thirst for a violation. I don't think that, I think we want the same things. We're trying to find, apply what available technology we have. I won't say we want the same things, in the sense that, as far as I can tell now, the data would tell us, I think the data is pretty compelling, that the headroom in terms of occupancy of this facility is so extreme that with respect to the average annual, there is no risk of VMT exceedances. There is some debate that we could have about, a peak summer day, and, I'm happy to drill down on that, but not waste your time doing it. If you want me to waste your time doing it, I'm prepared to do so. But, I think, we have been, as the league has been, good partners in trying to find a path forward. There's a little bit different perception on how we characterize this moment in time.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, because I don't think either of you, you have both been good partners, and I struggle to find the league is just wanting a violation. So I guess I'll ask them as well, sort of what what the issue is that they keep running into. Thank you. Julie, do you wanna?
Sure, just a couple wrap-up comments, and I know you're eager to hear from the public too. A few pieces that we have found agreement on in the last 18 months, and I just wanted the committee to hear, and when we go back to the full board, which we will, to hear from us. We have in earnest been trying to work this out, and so the characterization that we had turned a blind eye is not correct, and I think the facts matter in this. And there are just disagreement about basic facts among a lot of different parties, and that's part of the struggle that we've had. I will sum up a feeling that has manifested over the last 18 months in various meetings and countless hours, and it is umbrage. People have taken umbrage on multiple sides of the spectrum, from the applicant side to the stakeholder side, from the league to the Cal AG. You know, as soon as I got the job, we started in earnest trying to sort this out immediately. You know, went down to meet with the Cal AG staff, met with the league, met with the project applicant, community members have been weighing in on this. And so we've been really struggling to find a path that doesn't waste this board's time arguing with traffic engineers, because the battle of dueling experts in public meetings is not a good, efficient use of your time. So we've been really working hard to bring you something that's constructive, that, as you said, Chair Williamson, that honors the integrity of our permitting system, because the integrity of what we do matters. We need to send a signal to people doing big projects, whether they're on the private side or the public side, that those conditions matter and that we must adhere to them and bring this into compliance. So that's been our goal. Sort out this monitoring piece and then decide some of those other issues later, you know, the event cap, how it's calculated. And it's taken us to this point just to even sort out the monitoring. So I think we've got a good path for you, but just so that you hear it from our point of view, we want the community to know that our permit integrity must be upheld. But we also recognize this is a community benefit project. This is a public benefit, and there are environmental benefits of taking what was a very rundown corner sea of asphalt parking lot and building something that actually has the ability to move the needle and getting people out of their cars. After the TRPA holiday party, there was the John Legend concert, and coming down Kingsbury Grade, driving through the casino's core, people were walking from the show. And like, as a person who's been in the community more than 30 years, to see all that many people walking out and going places and not, there was some traffic leaving, but it was a lot of walkability. Like, that's from the policy side, what we're trying to get to. Have town centers be where commercial activity occurs, get people out of their cars, get micro transit flowing. All those things are important, but we have to fix this compliance issue. So that's our goal. And as Graham has liked to say, since he came on board as being general counsel, the other key piece, I think, for the public to understand too, is the scope of our authority enforcement. You know, when we resolve violations, we do it in two ways, and Graham can certainly jump in on this, but we work it out and bring the project applicant into a violation resolution that the legal committee vets, and we go to the board and we resolve it. Or we go to court. You know, we're not set up like a local government entity. We don't have police powers. We're not like the Lahontan Water Board with different enforcement capabilities. So we really have two paths. So we've been on path one of, let's figure this out. Let's do what needs to be done, and then let's vet this through the board. So just a couple of pieces I wanted to mention before we take public comment and hear more from you. But Graham, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, thanks for covering that, Julie.
Okay.
All right, with that, we will go to public comment. Anybody in the room, if you want to come up first and take a seat at the chair.
Ellie Waller, I don't even know where to begin as these discussions have unfolded. I mentioned at the closing public comment at governing board, there was a deadline in the permit condition to have this heard before December 31st. So again, if you've been discussing this as a team with the applicant, whoever needed to be involved, the league. Again, I'm sure there's no easy answer why it didn't happen.
But again, it is a permit condition, so why do we have conditions? We're setting an additional precedent in my mind. But you don't have to follow your rules. There's a way to talk yourself out of it. Again, I'm very, don't even know where to go with this. I don't want to waste your time or mine. I turned in what I thought were okay comments. It was summarized pretty well in a email from North Tahoe Preservation. And some of those issues in here are key, and one that isn't even covered in here is if we didn't have an event center, we wouldn't need a baseline. And I think we can't skirt the baseline issue. I don't think it can, we'll find a way to do it. The counter always tries me nuts, but that's okay. Not enough can be said in 3 minutes. I think the lack of consequences as perceived, and I use that word a lot now, undermines public confidence in how we, as the public and other entities, come before committees and boards if there isn't a resolution with a known problem that's been known for a long time. I have so many notes. I think it's great that you're having a discussion here today. I'm glad that this is going to the entire governing board. I'm hoping that it's allowed enough time because this is complicated and this has been controversial for a long time. And again, there's too many things to be said. Microtransit is an issue with this. It should have never been intended to be part of the solution. The JPA that's coming, the joint powers, that's coming forward is part of that controversial issue about transportation, and we need to have bigger discussions. And it's underfunded, and Douglas County, and I'll take just another second if you'll allow me. Douglas County has been told in discussions, if we don't bring the funding forward, it's gonna fail. Well, that's really difficult for me as a citizen and for an entity in a jurisdiction to say, oh my God, we have to do this or it's going to fail. So there's bigger discussions from transportation committees to this, and I appreciate the extra few seconds.
Thank you, Alice. Anyone else in person public comment?
Yes. We might keep it up here, there are a lot of things, but we don't wanna I've been talking with the whole team back to the league and, trying to keep it concise here. Also give comments to governing board, Chair Waver, because we were just over in that room. Actually, you were listening in, but, and we did send in a comment letter. I don't know if I copied you on it. I'll give it to you afterwards, nothing surprising.
I found it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the event center is a community benefit in a lot of ways. Like, we appreciate it at the league. I appreciate it as a person. I've only been to one event there, looking to be at more. We have no interest in reducing the number of events. We don't want to create a financial burden on what is a good project. That is nowhere near our intent. And here I can get directly to your question here in a minute. But TRPA's job is to uphold the integrity of its permits. And I've heard that come from a number of people at the table here and the governing board, so that's promising to hear. And if the lack of consequences for non-compliance undermines not only ours and yours, but the public's confidence in the agency. And, I think as more and more projects like this come up, that's gonna happen more and more. And a little bit of clarity on, one of the big frustrating parts is just how long this has taken to get to, and similar with the VMT threshold issue, which is still not resolved. We've been keeping an eye on this project since it was approved. We submitted a letter in August of 2023. Commenting on the draft monitoring plan, highlighting that the required Bluetooth monitoring was not in there. But before the event center even opened. We are equal partners plus a dozen other in launching and maintaining Lake Link and the band pools. Those aren't TDBA projects, no offense, but those is very much a group project led by the South Shore Transportation Management Association. Carol's on the board with me. and Darcy. We've commented quite a few times at committees and for the full governing board over the course of this year, saying that the monitoring isn't happening. We have issues with some of the other permit conditions that aren't being met. Like, we've used all the tools except for the media and legal tools so far, and we're not feeling like we're really getting anywhere. The event center is a good, like I said, it's a good project overall, and it's really resulted in some great collaboration between like unlikely and some likely partners. We don't want to put that in jeopardy, but the non-compliance is a big deal because it addressed, the permit conditions address concerns that the community and a lot of people had about building this big project right at state line. We're not so much concerned about the minor exceedance, but it's all the other, and there are violations of the permit conditions, and it is TRPA's job to uphold those. And yes, you guys, TDBA has been put in a tough spot in this one. The adaptive management has to be significant to address non-compliance. So, we sent in a letter, we suggested some very specific things, looking at what potential penalties could be, at what costs for remedies could be, at who's responsible for it, and feel like those are reasonable. So really hoping that that you, TRPA, can put in some remedies, can do it quickly, come up with a plan quickly, like a year and a half of talking about the same thing over and over, like just choose something and do it. And then let's get past this and start talking about like other things in the permit that aren't necessarily working. Local events, we'll talk about that later, even for the 3 or 5 years required in the permit condition, we're happy to get to that point. But we really do need to have these things addressed and like the remedies match the violations, so.
And Gavin, forgive me, are you seeking a dollar amount violation?
Nope. So what we've asked for is, we listed a handful of things directly from Appendix C of the permit, the adaptive management actions that take place if there's exceedances or exceedances. The two that we want to see things reduce VMT and that provide a benefit to the community. So actually,
can you repeat those?
the reason we've chosen the two highest priority
B
things
and C.
because to reduce BMT and to provide a community benefit. So the first one would be making the pilot transit for 2 hours before and after each event of 1,500 people or more, making that permanent, potentially part of the permit condition if the permit is reopened. Some kind of cost share on that with TTD hopefully, or a different service provider. And then the other one is improving pedestrian and bicycle access in the project area, specifically by contributing money, somehow helping to get the sidewalk that we all want built between the event center and Lower Kingsbury, and then taking on maintenance of that especially over the winter to make sure it's available for use year round. So there's a bunch of other things. We listed a few other options that we'd like to see. Those are the two priorities for us.
And Lou,
Madam Chair, may I?
please, I was just about to ask.
So we collect $4 as a ticket surcharge from every attendee. $1 of that $4 is earmarked for quote monitoring, which this first year has proved insufficient, but the other 75%, $3 goes to fund microtransit. And we think that's a great thing. We think particularly if the attendance is going to increase simply because now we have hockey, that the revenue that we generate is going to increase correspondingly. And that the more attendance we have, the more money we have. And we would be thrilled to reallocate, for example, 25% of this ticket surcharge for long-term benefit, like fixed route transit, like partnering on a sidewalk between Lake Parkway and Kingsbury. Somebody made the comment, which I happen to agree with, and no disrespect to our traffic engineer who's monitoring this call, we'd rather use these dollars for on-the-ground improvements than traffic engineers who we adore.
So you guys both agree there?
Yeah, we've talked about this.
Yeah. So I think there is, the ingredients for the cake.
Yeah.
We just got to get it in the oven.
And not to speak out of turn, but there also is the ability to increase that per person surcharge. So maybe that's part of this thing for a year or two, maybe increase that to make up for, just say they're talking.
We're all sort of marching in the same direction here though, right? That's a fair statement. Okay, we're waltzing, walking, hopping, crawling. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
What are the triggers to get the stakeholder group together to discuss the state of the permit? Can you just do it on your own? Or do I have to find a violation and send you to the table?
I think my public comment is done. Is there some-
No,
Okay.
Okay. I know this finding of a violation is, requires them to get back together, but is there anything for them to say, hey, let's have a cup of coffee and try to start talking this stuff through?
Can, Madam Chair,
Please,
may I jump in
yeah.
on that? I do want to address the stakeholder group, and yes, I mean, there's been a lot of coffee that's been pouring, and I think what you're hearing, Madam Chair, is we're vectoring toward some agreement here. So that's exactly why we're here, and it has taken a while. I mean, freely admit that, but we've done our level best, despite a lot of other pressing issues at the agency, to bring this to conclusion. I do want to put on the record, about a year ago, the stakeholder committee was about to meet, and we had requests from stakeholders to slow the roll of that meeting so that we could get more work done on the monitoring and get more agreement on what the baseline situation was going to be. So we said, let's not meet until we vet this at the legal committee. And that was about a year ago that we had that come up.
Yeah, but we did have some preliminary stakeholder meetings. I mean, like, Committeeman Colcuffer said, we said, hey, does this make sense to get the stakeholder committee together and talk about this deviation from a Bluetooth to something else? Does that make sense? And so we actually had 3 meetings. We have minutes from those meetings where you can see the conversations about the deviation and perhaps the new direction. And that was before the event center opened. So we said, yeah, let's get the stakeholders together. Does it make sense? Now, the official trigger in the permit says stakeholder coordination. TDVA shall organize coordination meetings with stakeholders to evaluate monitoring results. So that was the original sort of charge of the stakeholder committee, was to get together, take a look at the monitoring from the Bluetooth, from the level of service, and see what it said. And see if it made sense. Or was it affected by a super huge winter or another episode of COVID? There's some variables in there that would influence the monitoring results. It was really just sort of a check-in with those who had been involved in the development of the monitoring program to see if, we were on the right track. But we did sort of have that coffee with them when the applicant, thought about a new approach to monitoring. And I think that's a really important point, is that, and that concerns me in some of the conversations, is that the permittee did not ignore the condition. They believed that there was a better way to collect the information, and the information would be better, and that it would be cost effective to do that and more efficient. And so, again, they didn't ignore it. They proposed something different. Unfortunately, we couldn't come to an agreement before the event center opened to authorize that deviation.
It sounded like those conversations started like 15 or 17 months before the event center opened, right?
Yeah,
Right? According to your initial conversation, right?
Yeah,
They
that's,
came forward and said, this isn't gonna work, let's try something else, but you said that was in 22, right?
well, the specific stakeholder meeting dates were January of 23, April of 23, and July of 23.
So that'd be 9 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a potential path forward and I want to actually, I know this is very unusual.
Can we
Yeah.
still do it? Comments?
I'm so sorry. Yep, okay.
Sorry.
Because I was gonna ask for input on that too. I'm sorry.
Maybe Cooper will be.
Yeah. Is there anyone else that wanted to make public comment?
Good afternoon. My name is Kirk Walder, and while I chair the Douglas County Planning Commission, the following are my individual views. I also represent Douglas County on the stakeholder working group established to evaluate the Tahoe Blue Event Center agreement before you today. Based on several meetings of this group and discussions with leadership of Douglas County, I strongly support amending the current agreement. I personally believe the agreement is so flawed it should be repealed and replaced But at a minimum, I support the following changes. Number one, elimination of the limit on annual number of events and event days. Not only are there no limitation imposed on any other facility, but it's illogical to limit the event center when an event could simply be relocated to another property. The current limitation simply does not control vehicle miles traveled. Second, elimination of a summer event population restriction of 2,500. No such limits are placed on other venues, nor has it been demonstrated that occasional events of over this size create problems. Three, an end to the prohibition of the event center holding an event on the same day as a concert at Harvey's. What harm would a 30-person breakfast meeting, for example, cause when the Harvey's concert starts at 7 p.m.? Number four, at a minimum, provide a specific allowance for community activities to be held at the event center. Douglas County, other local government groups, and civic and organizations should be given unfettered access to the event center. For the most part, such events would benefit local citizens and would be of insignificant harm to Tahoe. I live year-round in Tahoe, and I see firsthand how paid parking and microtransit, as well as a number of other programs, have offset any VMT caused by the event center. And when it comes to calculation of baseline VMT data, you should consider actions taken by the casinos. What if you were to learn that some or all of Tahoe casinos made a decision to increase or decrease RFB by 50%? Either makes the baseline meaningless. Finally, one additional point regarding gate counts at casinos. That data is inherently unreliable. Consider a casino that holds $1 million drawing on the same day as a concert at the event center. Any gate count could be driven by either events or both. Thank you for your careful consideration of this matter.
Thank you. Anyone else in person wishing to make comment? Do we have comments online, Catherine?
Yes, Madam Chair, we have one hand raised online, three hand raised online. The first hand up is Doug Flaherty. Doug, please unmute to make your comment.
Hi, Doug Flaherty, TahoeCleanAir.org. There's been a lot of red herrings here today, but the basic situation here is we've had violations of the permit conditions that have not been adequately fleshed out. There's more than was discussed than just a general comment in the staff report that said that the TDVA did not implement the full traffic monitoring plan, and as a result, compliance with the VMT permit conditions cannot be assessed definitively. So we've got violations on the part of the TDVA. We've got unfortunate lapses of compliance on the part of the TRPA. Those are the two things that need to be dealt with here. Further, meetings shall include, according to the permit, TDVA shall organize a quarterly meeting with government, environmental, and economic interests to evaluate the event center strategy and monitoring results during the first 20 years of operation. B, annual meeting coordinations. TDVA shall organize an annual meeting with stakeholders during the life of the event center to discuss transit service operations, monitoring results, and projected transit needs. And it says the public shall be invited and given an opportunity to provide comment. There's quite a list of alleged violations here based on the fact that the public doesn't have any access to these written surveys. I hope you read my comments, but what I'd like to suggest is this. You guys are out of process here. We've got this, what I call a red herring attempt to move this pretty complicated process and issue to the legal committee, when if you read the TRPA Code of Ordinances, this really belongs with a hearing officer. We've got a comment from that the TDVA has requested the TRPA to consider modifications to one element of the traffic monitoring plan. Where's the request? I don't see a written request. Where's the written request? I think you guys should send this back to the stakeholder group, request the TDVA organize a special meeting, have all parties involved, and try to get this thing shaked out. And I think it should revolve around a report on the part of Julie Reagan as to what the actual assessment of the violations are and where TRPA dropped the ball. Nobody's trying to hang anybody out to dry here. But if you read my report and others, this is just unbelievable. Don't take action on this here today, except to say this needs to go back to the stakeholder meeting and the public should be involved because you're in violation of those two meeting requirements. So I have a lot more to say. I'm sorry I can't say it, but thank you very much.
Next hand up is Cody Bass. Cody, please unmute to make your comment.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I had to head to another meeting, but I did want to comment. I just want to say, what we've seen with the event center has been a real community benefit in a lot of ways. And I think it was said before, the when these events are exiting, the walkability, but really what's happening is so many people going to other businesses in the community through the casinos into the village to make peas after these events, and it's really done what it's supposed to do, in a sense, to be an economic driver for that area and revitalize the area. And it really has done that. And I think really what we also need to consider when I completely agree that we really have to do what we say we're going to do when it comes down to compliance of permits. And I'm fully on board and see that. But from what I'm hearing here is that there have been multiple meetings on the traffic counts and how we're going to do that. And I asked Mr. Feldman earlier, is it possible that we go back on the data from these gates at the casinos? And if we can do that, in my mind, and I don't remember exactly when these gates were put up at each property, but if we're able to do that, then we would have a baseline if they can give us that data before September of 23. And if it can go back further than that, then you really have a baseline because you start to see the same date a year before the event center was created to the date that, at that point. So I really want to put out the support to of course, this is going to come to the governing board, but I just think that we can get where we need to get with that data. And when we look at the local event side of things, I could not agree more, but I think we should go a step further. And I really think that when you're looking at an event below 700 people or 750 people, it should not count into that cap. These events are really Tuesday through Thursday, great conferences that are happening that are bringing people midweek at a small number, selling, hotel rooms and really just doing a great thing. So having it come against the event cap starts to get to where you get into, okay, we'd rather have a large concert because we're getting close to this cap and then do away with something that really is great for the local, population, local economy, and everybody, is to have Tuesday through Thursday smaller conferences, which is what the event center accommodates. And I know this is going to be further on down the road, but we also should really look at, when we have Harvey's Amphitheater in the summer that can operate and have the events that they can have, us having a little bit of a smaller venue possibly brings up events. And I'm not saying that you ever do them at the same time, but that you consider allowing summertime events at the full capacity, because we actually could start bringing in events with a little bit smaller of an impact than the Harvey's Amphitheater, which right now is what we try to book. And last year, as you saw, we didn't book quite as many events, and that's possibly due to the capacity size. A little smaller of a event could bring more talent that would come into our area. So those are my comments. I really appreciate this discussion, and I look forward to it coming back to the governing board. Thank you.
Thanks, Cody.
Last hand raised is Alan Miller. Alan, please unmute to make your comment.
Professional engineer, South Lake Tahoe. You have my written comments for the record, including late comments today, all of which I forward to the California Office of the Attorney General. And I gave testimony to the governing board today. This whole discussion is a distraction in the weeds of monitoring requirements, with TRPA providing defense for the violator to cover its own enforcement failings. It's not an enforcement action, as discussed in my comments. It's a sham, with both TDVA and TRPA colluding in the violation to the detriment of the stakeholders and the public. It's classic bait and switch. as discussed in my writing. If you act today, it is without legal authority. TRPA has worked as a developer partner in the Tahoe Basin for a long time. By chance, there was an article yesterday in the Nevada Current online paper titled TRPA Ducks Environmental Obligations by Pamela Mahoney Sigdinos to further underscore how lost and clueless the TRPA is as a regulatory agency. They spend $400,000 annually, something like that, of its $28 million budget, 1.4%, including lame actions like this. What do you think? You do what you think you must do under the influence of Mr. Marshall. Disenfranchise the stakeholders, and I'll be highly agreed. That's where things stand for now. The public should be outraged.
There are no other hands raised to comment.
Thank you. So here was my thought. And I know I realize that it's a little unusual for me to talk about a motion as well, so please jump in then, Shelley. My thought would be just to make the third motion, not the first two, which would be to direct staff to work with TDVA and stakeholders to bring a proposal by the February 2025 governing board meeting that A, brings the project into full compliance with the permit, and B, considers the request of the Nevada Legislative Committee for the review and oversight of the TRPA, a Marlette Lake water system, to exclude local events from the permit cap. I think that encompasses some room for staff to work with TDVA and stakeholders on the first two issues in the motions, because it feels like there are things that might be closer to resolution or that could still be worked out with stakeholder input. And everyone we heard from today, that's pretty broad, as opposed to making the first two findings, which feel like they may inflame or not be helpful, and just to leave it wide open. So we're still talking about full compliance and bringing the project into full compliance, but without making those first two findings and letting TDVA staff and stakeholders maybe take one more shot at this before they bring it to the governing board. That was my thought.
Well, Haley, I have no objection to that. In fact, if we were going to make the first two findings, I was going to require that it be in consultation with the stakeholders group, because I think, we've started down this pathway. This has been a very inclusive process. I think it needs to continue to be, decisions need to be made collaboratively, because we need buy-in, from the various parties who have been participating in the past. So, I certainly have no objection to that. Is there a requirement, John, that that we recognize this, what you've characterized as a minor exceedance? Do we have to acknowledge that up front?
No.
Okay, all right.
That way it's on the table for the stakeholder staff to know and everyone to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I would certainly not want to take a motion on number two. I don't actually think that day probably was a violation. I think it was probably easier to justify that it was not than it was. And I think if the parties can get together and talk about what data to use based on what we have, that's a lot easier than us making that decision.
One more comment. I know it's inconvenient. I don't know how many stakeholders there are who participate in these group meetings, but with the ability to do it remotely, I think we need to involve them, at a number of different levels. We can't allow things to continue, without consulting with them, because as I said, it's been a collaborative process since day one. I think some of them are feeling a little excluded, and I'd like to do whatever we can to remedy that.
And I think Ben made a point that motion number two, he's not comfortable making.
Well, yeah, I think we've agreed that your motion is probably adequate at this point.
Okay.
Lou had a comment.
Madam Chair, committee members, just one proposed addition to your motion, which would be to consider the request of TVBA to consider attendance versus event cap as a appropriate metric.
I'm totally comfortable with that. That's what I was hoping to include in that. So thank you for that amendment.
I mean, I think it's open enough that pretty much anything can be considered. Anything that you guys can agree on, bring back, and we'll talk about it.
Okay, so, can I make that motion as chair?
Of course.
Okay, all right, so I make that motion I just made with Lou's amendment. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
I.
Okay, motion carries.
No.
Online.
She dropped
it. Pulling it down. Yeah.
We still have quorum.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, do we have anything for closed session?
No closed.
Okay, so we're gonna move on then. Any committee member comments?
Madam Chair, I believe you do have one comment.
Committee member? Oh, no, I have,
You have a comment.
Yes.
I have a
Before-
comment.
before
Yes,
we
I
wrap
do.
it up,
I have a comment.
Madam Chair, if I may,
Yep.
just Julie Reagan here. I just thank you, and just, again, to reiterate, our commitment to bringing this to resolution. And I think this was a very productive discussion, so.
Can I ask one question, Julie? Is there, on page 285 of the permit in our packet, there's a requirement for the permittee to submit a $10,000 deposit for, I'm assuming, our monitoring costs. Is that adequate? In other words, have we exhausted that $10,000 or should we
I
consider
will-
augmenting that?
I will get back to you on that.
Okay.
I'll get back to you.
I would say we paid for all monitoring, you have to exhaust it.
Okay.
It's far exceeded, yeah, that, yes.
That's actually not Bluetooth monitoring, it's
It's
No, it's our
different.
staff time.
That's-
Permit
that's
monitoring.
us.
It's permit.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Well,
Okay.
I'll run that down.
Okay, and I do have a comment, because I know how much John Marshall likes to be praised. We have this really cool plaque. This is the TRPA prevails in the 18-year-old case. The Supreme Court ruled Tuesday that the 1980s era building moratorium in the Tahoe Basin was constitutional. So we have it's so hard to sum up how many cases you worked on, but one of the many important cases you worked on that we're so proud of that you did for this agency. And you're just invaluable legal counsel. You said earlier to someone this was your last meeting, and I just refused to hear that. So
Let me say, I'm assuming this was the Tahoe Sierra Preservation Council versus here.
yes, this was this, and so this.
No, I was gonna say that you are, some of the principals involved, Larry Hoffman was the attorney for the council, is dead. Mike Van Wagenen is dead, and
What are you
Don
trying to
Bass-
say? What are you trying to say?
Nothing, you're the mom. I'm trying to say.
So Julie, do you have other work as well? Because I know we've done this to you a couple times, John. No more work. Us and the legal
I'm gonna take a
committee,
picture.
we miss
Taking
you
the picture.
dearly already, even though you're still here and should come back.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, congrats.
Yes. Thanks for wearing the holiday jacket one more time.
Is that
I
Graham?
do have one.
Graham, is that?
No, but we are going
Okay.
to officially transfer the jacket.
Who's it going to?
She's the only one who has.
Oh my God. Okay, so good.
Love it.
That's amazing. That is amazing.
Look at the pride.
Right now, yeah.
That's amazing. All right, we are now on to final public interest comments. Unless any other committee members had comments, and I can call in for this, but I do have to go, I have childcare responsibilities. So I have, any other members of the public that wish to make a comment at this time? And Catherine, do I have the Zoom link here?
It's the same one.
Same one, okay.
Yes.
Hey, you guys, I have to
Sure,
pick up my
that's fine.
kids, but I'm
That's
gonna
fine.
call in. Okay, thank you
Okay.
guys. Thank you, Ellie.
I don't think, do we need a quorum to?
Well, I want to hear, I'll hear it. I'm just gonna, I have to get my
I'm
kids.
just brief.
Okay.
I'm really brief. I want to thank Graham in front of everybody here. Paul Nielsen is gone. I attended a recent meeting at my suggestion, brought some homeowners from Laurel Drive, which you've all been hearing from, but that's what brings me here today. There are still some concerns and issues with how violations are being handled. And it was suggested that we file violations with both Douglas County and TRPA till we figure out who's supposed to be addressing them. I think this was Jeff Cowan's suggestion at the meeting, but we still have unanswered violations. nobody is copying to the sign that's been put on the premises. That was my request. Whose standards? There's no project to have a sign. So that one, and then the water runoff. So I just want the legal committee and I know Steve Sweet, if he's still here, is busy. I understand you have other enforcement things going on, but again, you have another controversial project that will be coming forward. You've had a lot of pushback. There can be some positive things to this. We hope as the sub-district comes to fruition and that there will be some compromises, and this is what we all do here, like you are now. I just don't want to see this process unfold like what's going on with the event center. Thank you.
Any other public comments in the room? Madam Vice Chair, we have one hand raised online. Doug Flaherty, please unmute to make your comment.
Hi, Doug Flaherty, Tahoe, cleanair.org. So the chair has left, but I wanted to congratulate her on one meeting in 6 years where somebody had the guts to actually ask some questions and talk about compliance. Other than that, it's been void. I just want to pass on to TRPA that I am hopeful that people can get together and solve the issues. We need the event center. We need it to operate on behalf of all stakeholders. However, in the meantime, since I had to invest 3 days of my time to read every letter of every report on this issue, I personally am going to be seeking more information so we can figure out what happened. Now, I would prefer that the TRPA director come out with a report in a couple of weeks that says, hey, little self-evaluation, look, this is where LT or TDVA may have been in non-compliance, and this is where we kind of screwed up TRPA, and kind of, admit what happened. But in the meantime, absent that and absent the ability of the stakeholders group to get resolved, we're going to have to move ahead and start digging a little harder on just what happened. So I'd rather not have to do that, but if we have any indication from the past, this stuff gets swept under the rug quite a bit. The other thing I want to say is for those TRPA members that believe that there's people out here that are against all development, that's a red herring, it's garbage. What that speaks to is the inability of an evolved brain to come up with any reasons why the public may just have a point out there. So there's nobody that I know of that's against all development. I'm not. I'm for public safety, and I'm for reasonableness, and I'm for enforcing permit conditions. And I am definitely concerned about what's being painted here in many instances in the last couple of years of non-compliance and monitoring. So like I said earlier, we all have our roles. You have yours, I have mine, Ellie has hers, and so on and so forth. But in closing, I almost kind of freaked out because when John Marshall came in there with that jacket, I thought Mardi Gras was in February, and I was worried that maybe it had been changed to December. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug.
There are no other hands raised online to comment.
Okay, under public comments, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved. We are adjourned.